Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell, a collection of silverback gorillas who have learned the English language. This week's episode is on the pamphlet On Guerrilla Warfare by Mao Zedong, which was written in 1937. Written during the Second Sino-Japanese War, On Guerrilla Warfare advocates for a guerrilla campaign against the invading Japanese Imperial Army to support the conventional Chinese military effort. If you like what we're doing with this podcast and want to support us, we have a Patreon account, the link to which is in the show notes. We release bonus episodes on Patreon and are planning on expanding it to include weekly chats with Levi and myself about our most recent episode. I've also published a novel called Tower, a surreal, absurd journey involving the medical treatment of souls, a tower who remakes the world in its image, amphetamines, and a talking hat. You can find Tower on Amazon or on Apple Books, links to which are in the show notes. So, if you're ready to fight the war of the flea, then listen on. Enjoy. This is a very practical book.
We're going to bring you a practical episode this week.
We don't often have practical episodes.
What
do we have? We had practical female psychology for the practical man. You know that that's practical because the word practical is present in the title twice.
Mao could certainly learn.
Ride the Tiger by Julius Evola was billed as a practical approach to esoteric perennialism. That was another one of our practical guides. And on Guerrilla Warfare by Mao Zedong is a book that, because I have a little bit of familiarity with Mao, and was aware that he, particularly when compared to some other communist thinkers, is much more concerned with praxis than theory. He was a much more practically oriented man. But I didn't expect it to be quite as practical as this book, or I guess pamphlet, because it was a pamphlet in I think 6 parts.
Yeah. It's extremely practical. He could have called it. He could learn something from like the PUA guys though. Like he could call it like practical guerrilla warfare for the practical freedom fighter or something like that.
Yeah. For the practical, well, not necessarily the practical communist, because at the time of writing, so I think this was published in 1936. Published in 1937. At that point, the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party were still in an uneasy alliance against the Japanese. So
is that
it
like
could also be for nationalist fighters, although I'm pretty sure KMT fighters were almost all in the regular army fighting against the Japanese, and it was the communists who were doing most of the guerrilla warfare.
KMT were the nationalists, the Chinese Nationalist Party.
Yeah, and the party running the Republic of China, while the Chinese Communist Party had declared when we talk about the history behind this, maybe I'll leave it till that, because it will be really worthwhile discussing some of the historical background to this book, because it'll make a lot more sense in that context. But before we get to that, we can talk about how we came across this book, what we thought going into it, etc., etc. So also, shout out to anyone
came across this book.
Anyone watching this on YouTube, they get to see my fucked up eye. I've got an infected eyelid. I've just got a big bulging red eyelid. I've got hunter's eyes now.
But he still does this. He still does this goddamn.
I've got a
podcast
hunter eye. I've just got one of them. One of them's really narrow, extremely attractive to women.
How committed Jack is. That's how committed Jack is to this podcast. He's going to show up even when he's infirm and looking like some sort
Cyclops.
of Cyclops looking. So subscribe. Show Jack some love. Subscribe on whatever platform you're on. Yeah. So why did you pick this other than us having to shuffle around episodes? Like, what was interesting about this book? Why did you put it on the list, Jack?
Well, originally I had The Art of War by Sun Tzu for this week's episode, and I was looking at it because I picked it because so many, particularly business self-help books, cite The Art of War, and I thought in just such an obnoxious way. Like you'll have someone who started a company and completely bombed out, then write a self-help book ascribing all of their success to the art of war. And I, on the basis of that, kind of stupidly thought that the art of war would be fun to do. But I looked at it and just thought, oh, this is actually, one, I just don't know Chinese history from like the 6th century BC, which was around the time when this book was thought to have been written. Yeah, I know a bit about maybe the past 150 years of Chinese history, which works much better for the book I ended up choosing for this week. But like Chinese history from that long ago, I just don't know what's going on. Chinese history is so complicated.
But it's also, I've read The Art of War like a while ago, and it's kind of boring. Like
that's what I was about to say. Yeah, I started reading through it. It was like, oh, this is just a manual on how to fight in the abstract.
Yeah.
There's just not much for us here. What would be much more useful would be for us to actually read one of the American business self-help books based on the art of war for this podcast. That would be much funnier.
We could do a compare and contrast
about the art of war and whatever.
Whether or not
Tony
like,
Robbins
some
thought
business
of it.
book is just bullshit. Yeah. Whereas this is a lot more practical for the modern person. If you're thinking about joining Crypto Nukes Australia, bye, then
pump that price.
And you want to wage guerrilla war.
Book Club from Hell is
condoning,
the whale driving up the Bitcoin price.
Hypothetically, if you did want to wage guerrilla warfare, we're bringing you a banger from one of the classic guerrilla warfare experts of the 20th century.
Exactly. And when you're picked up by your respective intelligence agency for preparing to wage guerrilla war, you can cite this episode in inspiring you. Shout out to ASIO.
Shout out to ASIO. Yeah.
Big shout out.
Constantly on the Discord.
Shout out to the AFP. Massive shout out to them.
Shout out to any international intelligence agencies.
Who are listening to us right now. Shout out to the GIU.
Cool. So the CIA.
Anyway,
no, aren't they like quite an? I guess they would have their fingers in
the
Australian
Book Club from
media
Hell
stuff. Maybe the NSA
specifically
would be like
in this podcast.
Shout out to the Raptor Squad, New South Wales Raptor Squad. They're time.
Yeah, well, they're the
shout out.
The actuator. They're the tip of the spear.
The tip of the spear.
The global intelligence community. They're the ones who actualize global intelligence gathering. The Raptor Squad of New South Wales, deployed all over the world. Everyone talking about how the Ukraine war is going to end. It's going to end when the Raptor Squad gets involved and makes both sides stand down in fear of the Raptor Squad.
I've got a friend who's I won't say too much detail about them, but they are employed by one of the by like a police organization in Australia, and they're coming to visit in Tassie. I was like, oh man, we should like watch like Wolf Warrior 2 or something and get super high. And he's like, I can't really do that as like, oh yeah, like you're gonna get like drug tested and stuff, right? Like it's like, yeah. Like, okay, well we can maybe just have a drink and watch it. I don't want to get you fired. I'm sorry, man. Like just ignore my bad influence on you. And by get high, I mean like take a bunch of legal CBD oil that I definitely have.
Yeah.
So.
To go to Happy High Herbs and smoke some oregano that they sell to you.
Yeah,
man, get you a really good head spin when you smoke it.
No, that's just the lack of
You just inhale and smoke. That's why you're lightheaded. Stick your head in a fireplace for a similar effect. Anyway, I was answering your question about how I picked this book before we got sidetracked. Anyway, so for the reasons I just laid out, I decided against The Art of War. And while reading about The Art of War, I read that Mao Zedong was inspired by it. And so I just looked at things that Mao wrote about waging war. And yeah, came across this one on guerrilla warfare.
So, what were our expectations? What were your expectations when you got this?
So I've read a bit of Mao's work, not a great deal, and much less than I've read of, for example, Lenin. But this was pretty congruent with my expectations of something written by Mao. Mao was much more interested in practice than in theory. He'd read, so he had. I'm not sure if during his life he ended up reading Capital, but I know for quite a lot of his revolutionary years he hadn't read Capital because it hadn't been translated into Mandarin Chinese, and he didn't speak Russian or French or German or English or one of the other languages it had been translated into. So his theoretical knowledge of communism was more based on interaction with people who had read Capital, whether they be people from the Soviet Union or Chinese revolutionaries who did speak a language that Capital was present in. I think also just temperamentally, Mao was much more interested in doing stuff and the practicalities of getting those things done than in thinking about theory to a great extent. It's also,
I would say,
at a great level of generalization, sort of just the Chinese mindset versus the European mindset in action. This book, which something that did surprise me, that it barely mentions communist thought at all, really. It's kind of in talking about you need the support of the theory, you need of the people, you need to act in accordance with the people's wishes, and a reactionary movement can't really do that. Therefore, reactionary movements can't truly wage guerrilla warfare. So that there was a bit of communism in here, but really not very much. Especially considering that Mao Zedong is one of the most famous communist revolutionaries. So those were sort of my expectations going in, and they were more or less met by this book / pamphlet. What about you?
I didn't really have any expectations. I thought it would be more propaganda. It actually turns out to be almost like an instruction manual, or maybe not it's not really. No, that's not quite right. It seems like, so when I was reading a bit about the background, like the reason he wrote it was he was arguing with like other people about whether or not or in what ways they should do the guerrilla warfare in the Second Sino-Japanese War. And he's basically arguing his point of view about like the importance of like decentralization and how it complements like orthodox war units and like having a separation between like spontaneously organizing guerrilla units versus like the standard army and stuff. And from that point of view, it was interesting. So it wasn't really, I wouldn't consider it propaganda, you know? Yeah, so it's sort of my only expectation was that it would be more propagandistic, but it actually wasn't really that propagandistic, which is good, I suppose.
Yep, there we go. Sorry, my microphone disconnected. I had to reconnect it, and we're back.
We're back. So yeah, overall though, like, I wasn't biased against it or anything. I was fairly like neutral about it. I actually really appreciated, you know, like the fact that there wasn't too much of this communist crap in it. Like, that's very bad. I'm not coming in very like impartial into this anyway. I just get really like my eyes roll a lot when I see some of the communist theorizing and like too much mention of like historical necessity and that sort of stuff. There was a little bit of mention of class stuff. There was a little bit of mention of history, like making sure that something to do with like making sure it's aligned, like the resistance is aligned with the laws of history, like here and there. But as Jack mentioned, there wasn't really that much of it, and he wasn't trying to argue the point. He was almost just taking it as a given. He's like, okay, there's some stuff around like it's a given that there'll be class issues, but when you've got a national issue like the Chinese versus the Japanese invaders, like those class issues become secondary to like the national stuff. Yeah, so I actually really like that it wasn't too much like communist theorizing in it.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's
It really does what it says in
so
the title. Like, this is just a book about guerrilla
yeah,
warfare.
yeah. So context. I think you know a little bit more about the background and a little bit more about 20th century China and than I do. I know nothing about it.
Yeah, I have to preface this with my knowledge of the past century or two of Chinese history is kind of a skeleton. I know main events, I know generally what happened. Someone who's looked into Chinese history a lot, or a Chinese person, will know much more than me about this. But I can situate this pamphlet such that people listening will be able to understand the historical context a little bit better. So maybe one place where we could start the contextualization is in 1911. So in 1911, you had the revolution which overthrew the Qing dynasty. So China had been ruled by a succession of dynasties, a succession of monarchies for something like 2,000 years uninterrupted before this point. And there had been dynastic rule even before that. I just think there was some discontinuity. But in 1911, that came to an end because there was a revolution and the Republic of China was established. So it wasn't a monarchical regime that was put in place, but they were actually trying to establish a republic. And the National Assembly of the Republic of China declared Sun Yat-sen, who was an extremely prominent revolutionary, the president of the Republic of China. And Sun was of the Kuomintang, which is the nationalist party, who will remain very, very important, particularly during the Chinese Civil War, and even up till today, because I'm pretty sure the KMT is still a party in Taiwan. So Sun resigned from the presidency in favor of Yuan Shikai in 1912, and Yuan Shikai secured the abdication of Puyi, who was the last emperor of China, in 1912. Yuan continued to rule, but in 1915 he proclaimed himself emperor and reinstated the monarchy, and this was met with a lot of resistance, so from the population, but of particular importance from the army, which had shortly before the revolution been modernized. So you had a new, better organized army present who really didn't agree with Yuan Shikai appointing himself emperor. So he abdicated in March 1916, died in June 1916, and he hadn't consolidated power or appointed successors, etc., by the time of his death. And this contributed to the disintegration of Chinese political order in 1916. And China lost central control, descended into warlordism, and this lasted for decades. And in the 1920s, the KMT, under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, reunified China under central control in what was called the Northern Expedition. And during the Northern Expedition, there was an uneasy alliance between the Chinese Communist Party and the KMT. This alliance broke down after... So the CCP was undermining the KMT before 1927 with significant support from the Soviet Union, which kind of makes sense because the Chinese Communist Party didn't want nationalist rulers. Sorry for that break. My computer keeps disconnecting my webcam and microphone, and I have to keep restarting to make them work, to make me both audible and visible. So it was in 1927 the KMT violently attacked a number of opposition groups, including the CCP, in Shanghai, and this act started the Chinese Civil War. So there are two main phases of the Chinese Civil War. There's that point between 1927 and about 1931. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, which is a part of China. And the KMT and the CCP didn't completely bury the hatchet, but they started fighting against the Japanese, or the Imperial Japanese invading force, more than fighting against each other. It's also actually, at this point, I mention this more because this is a really, really important part of Chinese communist mythology. It was in 31, as well as Japan invading Manchuria, that the CCP declared areas of China as the Chinese Soviet Republic. This was declared in Jiangxi. The Jiangxi Soviet was destroyed by the KMT in 1934, and the communists moved from Jiangxi to Yunnan in what would be called the Long March. The Long March is a really, really central part of the CCP's sort of founding myth, or their mythology. Yunnan would be the CCP's base until their victory in the Civil War in 1949. All right, so 1937, Japan invades other areas of China in addition to Manchuria, and this starts the Second Sino-Japanese War, which lasted until 1945. Between 37 and 45, there was this uneasy alliance between the CCP and KMT. This is called the Second United Front. Also further complicating things, during this period, there was a Japan-supported puppet government in China, led by Wang Jingwei, which notionally controlled the parts of China occupied by Japan, but I don't think it really wielded any significant power itself. In 1945, World War II ended, and hostilities resumed between the CCP and KMT. So, up until 37, the KMT controlled more of China than the CCP. They had bigger armies. They were in a dominant position. Then you had this period of war with Japan where the KMT really bore the brunt of it. As we'll talk about in the course of discussing this week's material, the Chinese Communist Party focused on guerrilla operations. The KMT, having the regular armies, was the one that really bore the brunt of the battlefield costs against Japan. And so after 1945, the KMT was much weakened. The CCP was much stronger. And in this second stage of the Chinese Civil War, the CCP was the more powerful party. And the KMT eventually got pushed out of mainland China into Taiwan, where they remain to this day. And so in 1949, Mao Zedong proclaims the People's Republic of China in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. Should note too, actually, that the Republic of China, that is China under the leadership of the KMT, continued to wage guerrilla war against the People's Republic of China in Western China into the 1950s. So we have these dates. They're not hard and fast delineations between you. You have civil war, no civil war. It's a bit messier than that. But that is the very, very high level history of the times surrounding On Guerrilla Warfare by Mao Zedong. So this pamphlet was published in 37. So it was at the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 37, when Imperial Japan invaded the rest of China outside of Manchuria.
So the Second Sino-Japanese War goes from 37 until the end of World War II, when Imperial Japan surrendered.
Yeah.
I think, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, did I say 32? 37.
37.
Yeah, so that was a great high-level overview. That's a whole bunch of stuff that I didn't know. Thank you very much.
I mean, I could have just made it up. There'll be a lot of details in there that I won't. Like, I will have either gone over or just don't know. But
sure.
I think in terms of understanding this text, that's probably what we need to know.
Yeah, it also contextualizes well some of the points he makes about, like, such and such isn't actually... You know, I think he made some comments about, like, the KMT can't actually do guerrilla warfare properly because they're doing it with, like, they don't have the support of the people or something like that.
Yeah.
Which actually makes a lot more sense now. Yeah, really interesting. It just makes it makes me appreciate just how, I guess, like, complex that... I mean, it's like any region of the world. Like, once you actually start reading the history of any region of the world, you realize just how complex the history is oftentimes, and especially China and Korea and Japan and so forth. Just yeah, really interesting history. Uh, Also makes me appreciate like, was there really, given that the like eventually Imperial Japan, but also the collapse of the dynastic Chinese structure, was there really any version of the 20th century where that worked out well? Like, I don't know. Like, it just seems like even if, say, the CCP lost eventually, and you had the KMT taking power and stuff. I mean, in Taiwan, it seems to have worked out okay because they're like thriving democracy now, and all that sort of good stuff. But maybe if the KMT had won in China, on mainland China, maybe they would have just become extremely authoritarian as well. Uh,
Yeah, well, they
yeah,
were already very, very authoritarian. It was a
yeah,
military dictatorship. They
yeah.
kind of softened over time, but yeah, I don't know nearly enough to be able to really answer any sort of
Oh
alternative
no,
history questions.
But it just
It is an
makes me
interesting
wonder,
thing to think about.
because the CCP has been pretty bad. Uh, but it's like, well, would there? So, what are the two major alternatives? The KMT, authoritarian nationalists, or like more imperialism, who
Yeah,
are
just
also pretty
Japanese
bad,
massacres.
or Chinese, like a Chinese emperor. So yeah, it looks pretty bad no matter which way you look at it. Uh, the other interesting thing about that history is like makes me appreciate that some of these patterns of like, oh, a quote unquote revolutionary or resistance fighter gets into power and then, oh, who would have thunk it? They declare themselves the emperor now.
Yeah, that was quite funny
that,
what Yuan Shikai did. I'm emperor now. I want to be the emperor.
And then Mao Zedong at least was smart enough not to call himself the emperor, but just like essentially became the emperor, secular, like or like communist emperor for life.
Pulled the Julius Caesar move. Not
Yeah,
a
so
king.
well, that's what I was about to say next. Basically, like Julius Caesar did it. You know the Kim family did it. Yeah, Bashar, Al-Assad Bashar's father did that shit. Like it just it's like a cultural invariant that just happens. Like no matter what culture you have, if you have some violent bastard who leverages a resistance to become kingpin, they just then make themselves the new ruling class. Happened in Russia, it happened in France. Like this is just something that tends to be men. I don't know if I can think of any female examples, but people, it definitely seems to be something that people do. They leverage like the resistance
It's a dude
movement to
thing to
become.
do.
Yeah, like I can't. There might be a female example, but I can't think of a female example in history. It's very heavily.
Like if we're talking about
biased.
China, I guess the Dowager Empress, I absolutely cannot pronounce her name because it has this I can't say it noise from Mandarin Chinese, which English speakers just can't do.
Can't do.
But the Dowager Empress certainly accumulated a lot of power, particularly over Puyi, but she didn't declare herself. Yeah, I don't know. I can't think of an example of a woman like leading a revolution and then installing herself as like
Look,
the
even
not
even
king.
if there was, even if there is one exception, it really just proves the rules. Like, okay, you have to like scrape all of human history to find like one woman who does this.
Yeah, it seems a male biased thing to do.
Yeah, much like our podcast, but I promise there's no relationship between the two.
Violently impose your will on others.
So, yeah, cool, great. So, what problem situation? Like, what was what was Mao Zedong's problem situation with this? I think it's kind of pretty obvious, right?
Yeah,
from the history and the title. He's
yeah,
advocating using guerrilla war against the Japanese, basically.
Against the Japanese, but also it needs to be understood in the context of the KMT had been fighting against and killing CCP members until quite recently. So it was also probably with a view of once the Japanese were removed from China, continuing war against the KMT, which is exactly what happened.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, luckily, Mr. Mao, the chairman, has
The
structured this
pre-chairman.
episode for us very well.
Yeah, we're
Makes our life
basically just
easy.
going to follow his structure because this pamphlet
Oh,
is really
have we had a
well
drop?
set out and doesn't
Has
repeat itself much
Mr.
at
Jack
all.
dropped
And
out?
in the places where it does repeat itself, he just says, "I've already talked about this. You can look back
Huh.
in my writings if you really want to hear about this particular point again." So the first section is just called "What is Guerrilla Warfare?" And yeah, Mao being a practical man, it this chapter just does what the title says. He talks about what guerrilla warfare is. He both defines it and he also says why it's important. So in terms of what guerrilla warfare is, he says that it's not fundamentally it's not something that should be used separately from using conventional military tactics. It should be used in conjunction with them. So he says a conventional military campaign is one of moving large numbers of troops to positions and defending those positions, and in that way trying to occupy more and more land. As opposed to that, a guerrilla campaign is using more diffuse groups of people, and instead of trying to occupy a piece of land and then defend it, you move around and try to harry the enemy at their rear and cut their communication lines, damage their supply lines, that sort of thing. So it's a highly mobile type of war, and one that's not so much concerned with taking and occupying positions, because that's the job of regular forces.
And there's definitely an element of like not necessarily engaging in direct combat. So you,
Yeah.
as like Jack said, like you take out communications or you attack them from behind when they're least expecting it with like a small group, and then you disengage and retreat. So one interesting feature of guerrilla warfare, as contrasted to regular operations, is the decentralized nature of it. I think that's one of the key distinguishing features. So in Mao's idea, there's like regular operations, which is hierarchical, centralized, coordinated, and like typical military operations where they're identifiable. Yes, this is the military, and we're engaging in this operation. And in order for like lower units down to do something, they have to have, generally speaking, authorization from higher command. Whereas with like guerrilla warfare, it can be extremely decentralized, and as far as Mao is concerned, they are politically or ideologically aligned with, like in Mao's case, like the people, quote unquote, or like the resistance. Then it's fine. They just go and do what they need to do, and it complements like regular operations, which I found really interesting. That like decentralization of it.
Decentralized,
And
but Mao
it doesn't
does
have to be
reinforce
the
that.
regular operations doing it.
Yeah, there are a few things that are really important, though, like some important aspects of structure. That you need a political goal to
Yeah,
to
it's
to help
fundamentally
orient
political.
all of these groups that at any given moment might not be in communication with each other, but they all need some sort of long-term political goal, both so that they can orient themselves, but also so that the people, quote unquote, the people can be basically propagandized to. And Mao makes a big point that you need to propagandize to the people to let them know what you're doing so that they support you. He also does say that each of these guerrilla cells need to have fairly clear instructions so that they can, even though they're operating without necessarily communicating with each other, they need to be working towards the same cause. They also need to be able to work with the conventional army. And they also need to be able to establish things like bases behind enemy lines so that they can continue harrying the enemy. And especially once those bases are set up, they need to have, Mao talks about, they need a political officer to ensure the political goal is adhered to. They also need a chief of staff who's going to organize military operations and things like that. So it's really interesting how he sets out that a guerrilla war needs to be fought. You need to be very flexible. It's not like you have a really large regular army and hold territory using that. But at the same time, it's not totally anarchic. He works out ways that even if a group of people split off from other guerrilla cells and establish themselves in a new piece of territory, there's a particular structure that they need to form themselves into once they're there.
Yeah, and so that's really interesting. I thought the that idea of ideological alignment was really interesting for the guerrillas. In particular, I guess it makes a lot more sense now that you've spoken about the history, because he's trying to prevent like the warlord situation from arising again. And you definitely see that, like last week's episode was France Fanon, or a recent episode was France Fanon, and a lot of the decolonization things that happened in Africa in particular did fall into that, just like anarchistic, just warlord situation. And, at least under Mao's analysis, he might say, well, it's because they weren't the guerrilla units or whatever were not sufficiently ideologically aligned and or aligned with the interests of the people. And so you have this like splintering and eventual decay into just like warlord anarchy in certain parts of like 20th century Africa, as opposed to like the unification under the CCP in China, which is really interesting.
I guess that's maybe an important point of distinction between guerrilla war and maybe just either warlordism or an armed anarchy, is that at least in the way that Mao defines it, guerrilla warfare does have a structure. So there's both a long-term strategic goal of whatever the political goal that Mao says you need to work out and have very clear to begin with is. And then also in terms of more medium-term strategy, very, very short-term tactics and things, Mao did set out general principles that could be adhered to make this function in a structured way and not just descend into decentralized violence. Hopefully that was the last of the internet disruptions. Hopefully it'll be behaving properly now. But I was saying that maybe this emphasis on some sort of order to the fluidity of guerrilla warfare is one of the main distinguishing features between guerrilla warfare and decentralized anarchic violence, of just arming a bunch of people with guns and basically have them carve up a piece of land that used to be a country in basically whichever way they see fit. Having this orientation of a long-term political strategy as well as an organization for different guerrilla cells is something that prevents the descent into just decentralized violence, or at least makes that descent less likely.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good distinction. The word that you used there was fluidity. I think that's a good way to think about it. It's more fluid, or I think Mao used the word mobility. Guerrilla warfare is really focused on the mobility, the flexibility, the fluidity of the units, and the fact that maybe citizens can be a part of guerrilla warfare, people who wouldn't typically be combatants, so people who might not be a part of the regular operations. But as Jack said, there is still an overarching structure and a unifying idea, a goal, and then at the end of the day, did he say this explicitly, or am I just reading between the lines, that there comes a point at which the guerrillas can stop, and if they don't stop, then it's not really guerrilla warfare. It's just, as you said, like decentralized violence, really. So there comes a point where it's like, okay, we've won the war, now we stop that and we unify, and so forth.
Yeah. He did offer a few different, I guess you'd call it, exit strategies for guerrilla fighters. One of them is that he says over time, if the guerrilla campaign gets big enough, gets enough people in it, gets well funded enough, controls enough territory, then guerrilla fighters can turn into regular soldiers in a regular army, as opposed to irregular guerrilla fighters. That's one way. or if they're working in concert with a pre-existing regular army, which then recaptures the land or achieves whichever political goal they had as their long-term strategic goal, then yeah, they're demobilized. Because again, they're troops who are serving some greater purpose and are ultimately beholden to some sort of command structure. And so they can be demobilized, unlike warlords or just people running around with guns.
Cool. So that sounds like pretty good distinction between guerrilla war versus just violent anarchy, which I think is good.
Actually, one thing I was wanting to also to point out that I like quite a lot in this pamphlet is he quotes Lenin and von Clausewitz in saying that there aren't really abstract principles of war, let alone guerrilla war. I mean, that kind of does sit a little bit uneasily beside the more organizational parts of this pamphlet. So there are certain parts of this pamphlet that are very much targeted towards trying to convince people to fight a guerrilla war against Japan in the way that Mao wants it fought. But Mao also does actually provide general principles for how to fight a guerrilla war. But he at least, at the same time, acknowledges that every war is different, the geography is different, the history is different, the culture is different, the adversary is different. And as such, you shouldn't rely on abstract principles that purport to be almost out of time or out of history in devising a guerrilla strategy. So he almost places limits on this pamphlet in saying that. He's basically saying this is applicable for China in 1937 in fighting against Imperial Japan. He really,
nice
really historically circumscribes this work.
Yeah, it's refreshingly practical.
Yeah, immensely practical.
Very communist book. Okay, cool. So what about, we sort of already touched on it a bit, but the next section was about the relation to guerrilla operations. Sorry, so the relationship between guerrilla operations and regular operations.
Yeah.
Which we sort of, as I mentioned, we already sort of covered a bit, but the overarching idea is that guerrilla operations are supposed to complement regular operations.
Yeah. Regular operations are the ones that will ultimately take back territory. Because to hold territory, you need a lot of troops, and you need a lot of very well equipped, very, very highly organized troops. And what guerrilla operations can weaken the enemy by, as we said earlier, damaging their ability to communicate, damaging their ability to transfer troops or material, and forcing them to divert troops from the front where they're fighting against a regular army to their rear where guerrilla fighters will be harrying them. I guess, it's all of this pamphlet needs to be viewed from the perspective of Mao is trying to convince other people in China to fight in the way that he wants. And what he wanted was for the Chinese Communist Party guerrillas to be harrying the Japanese in part to get the Japanese out of mainland China or all of China. Also in part, I imagine, to deplete the KMT's ability to fight wars, because I'm sure Mao was aware that they would resume hostilities if the Japanese were expelled from China, which is exactly what happened. And Mao was extremely canny. It would not surprise me at all if, in advocating for this way of persecuting the war against Japan, or prosecuting the war against Japan, he wanted the nationalists to be weakened in making them the main force to bear the brunt of the Japanese imperial army.
Yeah, it's really it's really fascinating, man. Just on that note, like in terms of his communication style, this is very practically written. Obviously, we read an English translation, so I don't obviously know how well written it was in presumably Mandarin Chinese, but he was a very good communicator, And that's not surprising,
Yeah.
I suppose, given that he was the dictator of one of the largest populations in the world.
Yeah, one of the most consequential people of the 20th century.
Yeah, perhaps, yeah, like right up there with Stalin and all the other big leaders. So, and maybe arguably the most influential leader in like Asia, right? So,
Mm.
yeah, actually just a really like cogent communicator.
Mm.
So yeah, anyway, it's just sort of side note.
He was playing 5D chess here
Yeah, he was really like
because he was
yeah.
fighting the present war and a future war with the KMT at the same time.
And then he ended up ruling for a long time. He must have been an insanely what would you say? He must have been like a brilliant person, you know.
Yeah,
Like,
he was highly effective and also completely ruthless.
yeah, ruthless, effective, just complete lust for power. Yeah, but I guess when you select amongst hundreds of millions of people who's the most effective,
Yeah. If you have that big a population, you're going to turn up
controlling others. Yeah,
some very optimized people.
yeah, interesting, super interesting. Is there much to add about the relation to regular operations? Oh, one thing I'd say about the relation with regular operations is that like the what was interesting is, or one of the things I found interesting was that he had this idea of like the guerrillas aren't necessarily beholden to the same, I suppose, standards in terms of like they can retreat. That was one that I found interesting. Like, yeah, they can go do their skirmish and then retreat, or if they're losing, it's fine for them to retreat. It's not a big, it's not a big deal. Whereas, like maybe for regular operations, there might be whether it's a matter of culture and honor, or whether it's a matter of like tactics. Like under certain circumstances, you don't retreat. And whereas with guerrilla, the guerrilla units, they can do whatever they need to do to like achieve their aims, as long as they're like they've got like their ideological alignment, and yeah, they can kind of do the things that maybe the regular ops are not going to do, essentially.
Yeah, because I guess it's also one of the roles of those two different styles of complementary warfare.
And that's exactly right. I think you put it really well just then. Like, and we'll touch on this later, like the relationship between like guerrilla warfare and like terrorism and that sort of stuff. But for now, it's important to note that I suppose under this framework, what Mao's explaining is they're both styles of warfare. And I thought that was really interesting. Like, at least nowhere in this book did I, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jack, but he does seem to think that guerrilla warfare should be aimed at, I suppose, to use a modern way of putting it, legitimate military targets. Like he's talking about like attacking, military targets. He doesn't talk about attacking civilian infrastructure and that sort of stuff, or civilians.
Yeah.
And so this is essentially like a way of waging the war. On the one hand, you can do it structured, centralized, and highly coordinated, or you can do it like less structured, more decentralized, more sort of like coordinated ideologically, but less coordinated in terms of like logistics and so forth. But they're both forms of legitimate warfare against legitimate military targets. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, it's because in part, I guess he didn't really have to think about what to do with Japanese civilian targets because
yeah, true.
The communists had no way of reaching the islands of Japan. But he's, at least in this text, he's pretty clear that they should only be attacking military targets.
Yeah,
like you said.
Was there any other major concept in the relation to regular ops that you found interesting?
Nothing that we haven't gone over. I guess the one thing I want to emphasize is that Mao said the ultimately decisive thing is going to be what the regular army does, because they're the ones who are going to be able to take back the territory from the Japanese.
Yeah,
he acknowledged that guerrilla operations can really weaken the enemy, but probably can't actually get rid of them.
And importantly, I suppose, like it's not a replacement for regular operations.
And it's interesting thinking just how much of that is. It'll be in part because he really does think that a guerrilla force can't take back territory from a conventional force, but also I can't help but think that he is pushing the KMT to the front here to try to get them
that's really
smashed by the
interesting.
Japanese, so that the communists can eventually mop them up after the war.
Yeah, he really is playing like 4 or 5D chess. Hey.
Yeah, he's fighting a current and a future war at once.
And then that's interesting because, I mean, I don't know if this is how I was thinking, obviously, but he might have been thinking as well, like, if the KMT takes the territory, but we've got all the guerrilla bases set up already, then they're basically taking the territory, and then we'll already have our guerrilla units in place.
Not merely that, because he talks about once you've established a guerrilla base, which he said was really important, he said in all of them, it is really important to have printing equipment to be able to print propaganda pamphlets.
Yeah.
And we can get to the section where he gives specific instructions for what each base should have, but he's very explicit. Each base should have a printing press. Yeah, and so not merely will they have the bases, but they will have been propagandizing to the population.
So if the
initially
at
least, so what he says here, it's propagandizing for a China free of Japanese imperialism, but it will be building up popular support for the Chinese Communist Party. And you can imagine it's not much of a stretch to flick that to anti-KMT propaganda if need be. So he's laying the groundwork for a campaign or a resumption of the civil war against the KMT once the Japanese are removed.
Like with historical hindsight, you can see that that's just like. I would be willing to assume that was intentional. That he knew exactly what he was doing. It seems too convenient, and especially given like how talented he was at doing this sort of stuff, that would have been an accident. Makes you really appreciate just like, imagine going to war, whether it's like actual war or just like a political war, with a person like this.
Yeah, who is just playing 5D chess.
Yeah, like that's crazy. It's crazy that there's even people that exist like that. Presumably there's people in Australia who aren't violent, but are like trying to think that many moves ahead and that sort of thing. But to read it in a historical context now, like with China and stuff, it's
also because we can see how it panned out. We can see what happened after 1945.
Not that I like dictators, but I sort of do have a weird sort of I suppose respect for the guy.
Yeah, well, I guess you can respect his organizational and his planning abilities, which, like, whatever you think of Mao morally, like, it's very hard to dispute the fact that he was a brilliant organizer, brilliant strategist, and at the level of tactics as well. He was highly capable.
It was it's not like Stalin. Stalin was like that, like an incredible organizer, incredible ops person, and you have to think like these guys are. It actually makes them more scary to think that
much scary.
Yeah, like these people. There's certain individuals out there, and their supporters who are just unbelievably good at organizing and logistics and so forth. And they might choose to put that towards, just like seizing power.
Yeah, and they're willing to dispose of you if you get in the way.
Man, I'm glad to be living in Australia.
Yeah. You don't have to deal with them now.
Yeah. So, anyways, I think that's enough to do with the relation between regular ops and guerrilla ops. There's a section on history. I don't know how much you want to talk about history. It basically just goes over a bunch of historical examples of where guerrilla warfare has been used. Did you have anything to note about that?
He did. So he did mention the Peninsular War, which is there's just like a tidbit of information. It's where the term guerrilla comes from. The Peninsular War was between 1807 1814 in Spain, like on the Iberian Peninsula, and it was between Spain, Portugal, and UK on one side, fighting against the invading French forces during the Napoleonic Wars, and guerrilla, like guerrilla, it just means a little war in Spanish. So they were the small irregular units who would harry the Napoleonic forces. So he mentioned that. I don't know, that's kind of just a trivia question if you attend really fucking weird pub trivia nights.
That's really interesting. So they were the first historical example of these sorts of tactics being used.
I think, well, Mao says, and I'm inclined to agree with him, that these sort of tactics have been present in every single war.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
more
yeah.
that's where our word comes from,
Yeah.
the word that we use to describe it, and it makes sense. I imagine in every war there has been some guerrilla tactics used. That was also the main seems to be the main thrust of the argument, or not even argument, just this chapter talking about guerrilla warfare in history, just how it's always been there. And what Mao is doing is drawing attention to it in the context of the Second Sino-Japanese War and advocating for its use. He brings up a bunch of examples, like in the Russian Civil War, saying, "Look how effective guerrilla warfare is when used in conjunction with a regular force. Let's do this." I don't really have much more to add about this
No.
section. Do you?
Well, no. Let's get on to the next part because the next part's better. So,
Yeah.
a very important question: can victory be attained by guerrilla operations?
Yeah, and like, plot spoiler, no. This is this is an interesting part. Again, just speaking to Mao's practicality, where he lays out in general terms the, I guess the tactical and the strategic situation in China at the time, because he says Japan's advantages and disadvantages. So the advantages are that it, at least at the moment, seems to have a fairly unified command. They've, particularly post Meiji Restoration, they really, really updated how they fight militarily. They have new weapons. They have very, very good weapons. And they're on the attack, like they're in China's territory. Whereas China can't really retaliate against Japan itself. So China's on the defensive. The disadvantages are, they say Japan has a small population. I guess that's compared to China. Like basically anywhere except India has a small population compared to China. But yes, they have far fewer people than China. And in the context of the Japanese, so Japan itself, at least Mao says, they don't have that many natural resources. So the Japanese army is very, very reliant on taking Chinese farmland, Chinese industrial land, etc., so that they can supply themselves.
I would say that it's not merely that Japan has less natural resources in the abstract; it just has like less physical
area,
mass and volume as mainland China. Yeah, so it's kind of like, yeah, sure, okay, fine. They have less resources than you guys.
He also says, in terms of China, he says China is technologically and politically backward compared to Japan, and that's a major disadvantage.
Largely agrarian, less industrialized and so forth.
Yeah, much less industrialized. Because it's I guess kind of out of the scope of this episode, but for listeners, look into the Meiji Restoration in Japan, because it's just nuts what they did in terms of rapidly changing their society politically, militarily. It's just wild how quickly they did it, how considered it was, and how effective it was. But Mao's kind of saying China hasn't had that Meiji Restoration kind of movement. He says it's becoming less backwards, basically, but it's that process is hampered because they're currently fighting a war against a hostile foreign power on Chinese soil. He says in terms of advantages in China, though, it has a lot of natural resources, it has a lot of people, and also it has quite a difficult geography for foreign militaries to move through. And he says all of these things are really, really good for guerrilla tactics, because locals will know, for example, areas that would be really good to attack Japanese troops in. And so he says these sort of things really, really tip the favor towards guerrilla tactics in the Chinese context against Japan. Also, things like how the Japanese troops need to seize Chinese farmland and industrial areas to continue to supply themselves. He said for guerrilla troops, that's really good because you can harry those areas to impair, effectively, Japanese resource extraction. It's basically like StarCraft. Mao really was the original StarCraft Grandmaster. He would have been an absolute unit at StarCraft too. What else is there? He also says, actually, for these above reasons, the Japanese military needs to win the war really, really quickly, or it's going to lose it slowly. Because if it can't keep advancing at a fairly rapid pace, particularly Chinese guerrilla operations are just going to drain it of resources and bleed it over time. Because this is in part a propaganda work, because Mao's trying to bring people around to his idea of how this war should be fought, he presents a very, very optimistic view of how the war will go. He's quite sure that Japan will be defeated and kicked out of China. And what else is there? I don't have much more to say about this section.
No, I don't either, but I just wrote in our episode notes that like a question for the end of the episode that I thought was really interesting. It just came to mind. Yeah, no, I don't have anything else to say about that section. The next section is organization for guerrilla warfare.
This section I basically think of as almost the von Neumann probe of a guerrilla operation. It's almost this set of instructions that you can give to a person or a group of people and then send them somewhere else, and they will start organizing a guerrilla cell there. And that's one so that handy. Is itself self-sufficient and also can get in contact with the rest of the guerrilla network and the regular army and start conducting operations.
And you can see like the as I said before, like the brilliance of Mao Zedong. He's like thinking, this is a very practical thing to think through. It's like, okay, if we're going to have like decentralized units that need to do this, how are they going to like coordinate, and how do we actually set them up? How do we deploy them? He's like, there's a saying, or cliche saying, it was something along the lines of, I'm going to fuck this up. Anybody who's in like military stuff, like, please correct me.
This is all part of the quote, by the way.
It's something along the lines of amateurs think about strategy or tactics, and professionals think about logistics. And he really thinks about logistics. He's just very good at the operations. Like, okay, how are we actually? Yeah, he's the Jeff Bezos of 20th century China, I suppose.
Who, now that I think about it, would be a really, really terrifying general or someone leading.
See, this is one of my this is one of my main what would you say, like, refutations of like communism and other like totalitarian. It's like, you do have, like, inevitably you will have people like Jeff Bezos, and I would much rather him channel his creativity and his work ethic towards building like huge companies that, yeah, they have their issues around, like, say, sometimes they don't treat their workers so well, and we should definitely correct that, for sure, like, give them grief, but at least it's directed towards building something that on the whole is like building wealth for society. Yes, it's made him very wealthy, but it's also made the rest of us very wealthy, in terms of like the access to the technology that we have, you know, like I bet you our like podcast right now is being streamed over AWS.
Probably on AWS.
Yeah, like, so like there's a whole bunch of stuff that, like, the reliability of the internet is largely like the modern, you know, 2020s internet is largely thanks to the cloud revolution that Jeff Bezos kicked off with AWS. Okay, would you rather somebody with that sort of work ethic, creativity, talent, and genius direct their efforts towards building things like AWS? Or would you rather them direct it towards like something like what Mao Zedong was doing? Like Mao Zedong,
Warlord Jeff.
Like Warlord Jeff. Like, for all the grief that you want to give to him, at the end of the day, he built something that's very useful and a lot of people like. And he didn't kill a bunch of people. Whereas Mao Zedong directed it towards like killing his enemies and then like creating a totalitarian state. Like, it's like, and so did yeah,
it would have been much
so did
better
Stalin.
And Mao Zedong could have gotten into e-commerce.
Yeah. Like, that would be way further ahead.
Way better.
Yeah. So I don't know, like, it's something to consider. You're gonna have these like really effective, really talented, really high energy people in society. Where are we gonna direct their efforts?
I guess it's also it's producing prestigious channels for these sorts of ambitious energies to go.
Yeah.
Because they're gonna, with certain people, their ambition is going somewhere. It's
got to
go.
Like,
an immutable fact.
They're empire builders.
Something.
Like Jeff Bezos is an empire builder. He's built an enormous empire. Like, did you know there's over 1.5 million Amazon employees around the world? and they have like at this point like 70 data centers or something in cities all over the world, and like their revenues are like more than like dozens and dozens of countries like GDP. Like they're just like he built an empire. It's made out of technology and capital, and it's situated within like the political sphere of the West. But it
like the interstitial space of nation states.
Yeah. It's transnational like corporation. But he could have directed that towards like, I don't know, like turning the US into like a totalitarian war state. Oh wait, like I don't know, like the US kind of does fight a lot of wars, doesn't it? But like whatever. Anyways,
he could have made that structure a lot more effective.
Jeez, could you imagine Jeff Bezos just going into like, have you heard of Palmer Luckey?
Yeah.
Imagine if Jeff Bezos was like, all right, I've built AWS, now I'm just going to get into like military technology.
Was it Palmer Luckey who made the MMORPG Death Helmet? As like, just because he could, he made this helmet.
I don't know.
He made this helmet where if you die in game, it just kills you.
I don't think he did that. No, I don't think
he didn't. No, I'm pretty sure that was Palmer.
Maybe he made Oculus.
Like he didn't mass produce.
He was the co-founder or the founder of Oculus.
Yeah.
Are you fucking kidding me?
I just had a look at Oculus co-founder makes a VR headset that can literally kill you.
What a fucking psycho! What the fuck?
Like he didn't mass produce it, but yeah,
he just created a proof of concept.
Yeah,
it's like, okay, sure, yeah. You made your point, Palmer.
Good on you.
All right, yet another person who's terrifying. Great, fantastic.
But at least its energies are channeled towards like,
enforcing the technological advantage of the West in warfare, rather than our enemies. Yeah, sure. So
yeah, I guess there are stages of how culpable these channels for ambition are, but at least it's not like waging revolutionary war.
Yeah, I know. He does, like Palmer Luckey did make a good point. That's like, we need to have better technology. Like that's like you don't. There's no, like a lot of idealists are like, oh, like, isn't it a shame that we're spending billions of dollars developing this military technology? And it's like, yeah, but like, wake up, like the world we live in necessitates it. So you can like demilitarize us if you want, and then we'll just get invaded. Don't be.
Yeah, well, it's the realization that international relations are just the state of nature, like a Hobbesian state of nature.
Yeah, and you need a bigger stick.
Yeah,
this is like, you might not like it. Like I don't like living in a world where we've got all these nuclear warheads and stuff. Like it's pretty grim. But you're not getting invaded. We're not getting invaded. Largely, things are getting like over the long span of history. It seems like things are getting largely better for the most part. And yeah, in order to stop the people from like really going nuts and like invading places like Australia. There's like no military. I'd much rather the US have like great military technology than like better military technology than say like the CCP or whatever. Yeah. But maybe that's just because we're the satellite state of the US. Maybe I'd be saying something different if we were a Chinese satellite state.
yeah, depending on who our imperial masters are.
Yeah.
We're a province of Rome.
Anyways, we should get back to Mao. Hey, did you want to speak a little bit more about how guerrilla bands are organized, formed, deployed, and that stuff?
Yeah, like probably not worth us going into the specifics of how he said you should organize these things, because he goes into the detail of, okay, this is how many people should be in a battalion, this is how many guns they should have, etc., etc. But the basic concept of this chapter, Organization for Guerrilla Warfare, is he tells you very basic things. So if you're a person, or if you and a handful of people are sent by Central Command to a particular area in China to set up a base, Mao has given you a structure for how your units should be organized, how many people are in them, how your base should be organized in terms of which people are there and which basic roles need to be fulfilled, who should be answerable to whom, how you communicate with other guerrilla units, how you communicate with Central Command, how you communicate with the people of the place that you are setting up a base in, and how you start recruiting from the people, how you arm yourselves, whether you arm yourselves, say, by manufacturing things yourself or getting things from the enemy. It's really practical. This is basically
It
just
actually is an
a
instruction.
guide of like, how do I go to a place and set up a cell that is going to effectively wage guerrilla war against the Japanese?
I wonder how many guerrilla war or quote unquote guerrilla war um, organizations or units or whatever around the world since Mao wrote this book have actually like used this book as a template for organization.
Yeah, I wonder, because full disclosure for listeners, I have never waged guerrilla war myself, but at least from my admittedly uneducated perspective, it's like
Sure,
this
Jack.
stuff seems like it'd work. Like a lot of this is kind of common sense, but it's really helpful to have it just
It seemed
said
like it worked in
concretely.
China, didn't it? Like
Yeah,
it
it
seemed
worked
to
for
work pretty
Mao.
well, right?
Obvious. So, as Mao said earlier in this book, this advice is specifically for China in 1937. But with some modifications, I'm sure this stuff would work just fine, basically anywhere. Yeah, at least to answer your question, I expect this has influenced a lot of guerrilla fighters after Mao.
Yeah, and some of them didn't take on board the next section, which is the political problems of guerrilla warfare. And we sort of like alluded to it in our earlier discussion about the need for, I suppose, ideological alignment between the guerrilla units. But did you want to expand a little bit on some of the other problems that he touched on?
Yeah. I guess he says there are three broad groups of political activities. So we've said a few times, he reinforces really regularly throughout this text. He really belabors the point that you need a long-term political goal that you can sum up very quickly. And this is for multiple reasons. This is so that diffuse units can all point in the same direction roughly. It's so that you can propagandize to the people in the area that you are operating in. So that is really useful. But I guess that sort of political North Star, that goal, can be then disaggregated into three subcomponents. So he says that you've got three broad groups of political activities once you know your goal, and these political activities to apply to troops. He calls it spiritual unification of officers and troops within the army. So I guess maintaining cohesion of guerrilla units. As applies to the people, so this is how to spiritually unify the army and the people that they're operating from, because he says it's existentially important for guerrilla fighters to have the support of the people, because the people are going to be the ones who are helping arm you. They're going to be feeding you information about the enemy's movements. They're going to be hiding you. And also, they're going to be recruits. He says that you basically can't, as a guerrilla organization, compel or coerce people to fight for you. That's not going to work, because you're going to lose support of the people and you're going to get found out and killed really, really quickly by the enemy. So you need the people to be on board with you so that they'll voluntarily fight for you. And then finally, there's also political activities as applied to the enemy. And this is to break the unity of the enemy. And Mao talks about this a bit. This is definitely the bit he talks about the least. But he does mention that, say, the international community don't agree with Imperial Japan's behavior in invading China. And already that is causing fracturing of the will of the Japanese people. A lot of them don't want to continue the war in China, at least according to Mao. And so I guess there's some of that. And maybe you could divide it into breaking the enemy's will at home, which I get, especially with the technology available to people in the 1930s, was a lot harder than it is today, where you can just like, I get the question is how effective it is, but spin up a group of people who are basically just going to be social media trolls to try to damage your enemy's will, to brain rot them.
Yeah.
And then also attack them within your country.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I thought this section was really fascinating. He clearly what's his other skill? I guess he understands, what would you say? He understands people in a really interesting way.
Yeah.
And so he must have also been like um very socially like acute as a person. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think he makes a very good point that like waning support of the war internally in Japan, whether or not that was true, I guess, that might have just been him asserting that. But the Chinese also obviously had like much more at stake here than like, and not by the Chinese, I mean like everyday Chinese people in mainland China had a lot more at stake than just like your everyday person living in Japan, who is just like receiving imperial propaganda, and like it was the army that was off fighting the war. Whereas like Chinese people in mainland China were like at the forefront of all the atrocities of the Japanese war campaign. Yeah, very very interesting. I don't have a huge amount to like add. It's an interesting part of the book.
I guess
but
one
did you
thing
have
in
anything
this,
else to add?
maybe a difference between regular armies and guerrilla armies is Mao says that in guerrilla armies there shouldn't be a big difference in living conditions between officers and regular troops, because I get you don't have almost the same disciplinary apparatus as you do in a regular military. If someone really doesn't want to serve, they're just going to disappear. So that's kind of minor, but it is a point he makes a few times.
Yeah, and again, I'd just say that speaks to his like social acuity.
Yeah.
Understood that like these social dynamics could compromise the effectiveness of the guerrilla units if they didn't have this. But also, like, if you bring it back to that 5D chess idea before, maybe he was also thinking like this is an important part of like making sure that those units feel as though they're more aligned with the communist side of history, or like culturally communist rather than nationalist.
Yeah, especially I guess with the 5D chess aspect. So an aspect of Maoism that sets it apart from, say, Leninism is that Maoism really viewed the peasantry as the hotbed or a real actuator of revolutionary activity, as opposed to Leninism, which is more traditionally Marxist in that it focuses on the urban proletariat. Leninism, I guess, also looked at intellectuals, but it was more urban focused. And so, given that most of China was was agrarian or rural, and most of the places where the communists were fighting would have been rural, this also would have been a good way to make soldiers or people who had come to the guerrilla units to fight for them feel more sympathy for the communist cause, because they would have been interacting or being commanded by officers who weren't lording it over them in terms of their material circumstances, who were more, if not relatable, then at least weren't held to be hypocritically holding themselves above everyone else. It could also have been a propaganda tool based on Mao's ideas of the peasantry as the revolutionary force that would give the communists victory in China.
Yeah.
Maybe that's reading into it too much, but Mao was so good at organizing things during this lull in the Civil War to then go on to win the Civil War that it also wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. So the final section is the strategy of resistance against Japan. I'm not sure if like we basically like have already discussed all the concepts in.
It was exactly what I was going to say. A
so
lot
we
of
don't
this
really
is kind
need
of
to like
repeating
unpack
yourself.
it. Yeah, we'd just be repeating ourselves. So instead, do you want to go into like the episode specific questions that we came up with to ask to like and then sort of like move on to our closing questions. So
yeah,
we came up. So the way that we're trying to structure the episode now is like obviously talk about the main content, and we'll have our tangents and stuff, but hopefully somewhat less tangential than earlier episodes. like a year or two ago. And instead, we've like saved our episode specific questions where we can use the book as like a jumping off point to talk about other topics, like for after we explore the main content. So hopefully that structure is like a little bit clearer and easier to follow for our audience. So we'll get into some of the other questions that we came up with. The first question that we came up with is like, what really is the distinction between terrorism and guerrilla warfare? I think this is like, ever since I can remember, this has been an important question because the West, the US in particular, has always, but the West, and then to the degree that like Australia gets dragged into the stuff that the US does in like Afghanistan and stuff, this has been a constant question of like, you know, these people in the Middle East, are they freedom fighters? Are they terrorists? You know, freedom fighters or guerrillas or terrorists and so forth. Yeah, so I thought that would be a great question to ask. Do you have any thoughts on it at the moment?
Yeah, I see the two as they're quite distinct. They can be used together very easily and effectively, but they are distinct. To my mind, guerrilla war it's my definition of it doesn't really differ from Mao's. So guerrilla war as defined in the way that we've been talking about for the past hour or so. Terrorism specifically to me is the use of oftentimes violence against people to affect some sort of political change. So terrorizing people into doing what you want. And so at least in the context of the West fighting particular wars to stop terrorist groups, it's to stop particularly like mass casualty attacks against civilians to try to force either the civilian population to demand of their political leaders some sort of political change desired by people employing the terrorist tactics, or to directly frighten political leaders into doing what they want. Whereas guerrilla war is not necessarily a war that seeks to instill terror in people. It's a way of fighting a mobile campaign to harry an enemy's weak points, to try to embed fighters within a civilian population who will help them fight against a conventional force. I see the two as fairly separate because, for example, a regular army can employ terror tactics. By say executing civilians or something like that for every guerrilla attack against the regular force. And also similarly, like guerrilla fighters don't have to use terror tactics. So in this, say Mao said nothing about terror tactics really.
No.
He talked about things that would be regarded by, I imagine, basically anyone as attacks on military targets, so affecting supply lines or affecting communications by damaging communications, forcing the enemy to divert troops from one front to their rear by harrying the rear, things like that.
Yeah. So it's pretty. I guess I think largely agree with you. I think like a very famous example is the 1972 Olympics Munich attack. Like that was an attack on civilians, not military targets, and it was to a political end, and it was designed to, I guess, inspire terror or to use the threat of violence against civilians in particular to meet some political end. But there's a bunch of organizations that do this, right? Like in the modern context, a good example is like Boko Haram. Like, I don't, like you might like have your the reason why I bring up Boko Haram, like Jack and I said that we wouldn't talk too much about like the Gaza stuff at the moment because it ties us too much to like a particular point in time. But like all these disagreements that you can have about, say, Hamas. Okay, so don't talk about Hamas because it's very politically charged. But like Boko Haram, like is anybody really like arguing that who is the invader that Boko Haram is trying to like throw off? Like Boko Haram just like there's this really classic one where like Boko Haram they would, because they don't like women being educated, they would like go into schools and like burn the teacher in front of the children and then shoot all the kids. And it's like that. Like nobody's having an argument that that person is a guerrilla fighter or a freedom fighter. Like that is just like obviously just horrible terrorism, and that organization is not engaged in some sort of like, well, they're also like religious fundamentalists as well. So there's interesting, like it's not just a political over like aim, it's also like a religious aim as well. Whereas like what say like could we think of an existing sorry, excuse me. Another good example would be like Afghanistan. Like Al Qaeda, the 2001 attack on the US, the trade centers, terrorist attack, right? Obviously a terrorist attack. But then maybe there's certain like aspects of the war in Afghanistan when the US like actually put ground units in Afghanistan. The tactics that they were using were guerrilla tactics against the US.
I think the Taliban were definitely fighting a guerrilla war.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good example where like, okay, I think Jack put it really well like earlier in the episode where he spoke about like it's a style of warfare. It's a style of warfare against legitimate military targets. And the line terror is actually like, or terrorism is a separate, they can coincide, but they're somewhat separate. And so you can have regular operations committing terror activities, and you can have guerrilla operations committing non-terror styles of war.
Yeah. I think they're two separate separate entities, but yeah, they can also be used together very, very easily.
Yeah.
Like it's not only possible, but fairly common that say guerrilla fighters will also use terror tactics.
Yeah, and I just think like having now read Osama bin Laden's letters and now this thing from Mao and stuff, and just over the last couple of years, obviously, just like reading about different things outside of the podcast, being able to distinguish between the two, because a lot of the time people conflate the two, or conflate freedom fighters with terrorists. But
it's even freedom fighters, because that's another thing.
That's like another thing.
That's
well.
Separate again. Like freedom
guerrillas,
fighters,
freedom fighting, terrorism.
It's more a propaganda term. Like it says more about how someone would like to be presented than necessarily what they're doing.
Yeah. That's another good point. So like, hypothetically, not that there's any relationship to anything that's currently going on right now, but hypothetically,
Levi's about to get hyper political.
like, did Hamas go into like military bases? Yes, they did. They went into like military fortifications and they attacked military targets. But did they also attack non-military targets? Yeah, they did. They went into people's homes. Like, so there's a pretty big distinction. And then there's also a distinction against like no, actually, I'm going to stop there. No, because like Jack was like, before we started the episode, it's like, let's try not to get into that because it'd just be too heated. So I'm not going to like get into it any further.
It turns up the heat, emotional, heat, or emotional temperature a lot, and I don't think it necessarily.
It doesn't add anything. So
it doesn't.
I'm going to stop myself.
It's also like, yeah.
Okay.
It's also like, are we the people who are going to be offering some really deep insight on this?
No. We can cut that out if you want. Like, fuck it.
No, we'll leave it in. It's just like, broadly speaking, we definitely have an oversupply of people who are very poorly informed, offering very strident opinions.
I think that's a very good point.
That is what we would be giving to.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And also, like, yeah, it's not really about like what this episode's about. But next one. Imperialism and colonialism in the context of Asia. I thought this was really interesting. Like the way Japan conducted the war in China. When you look into the history of it, like it was horrific. Like it was
so like there is a reason why the Chinese and Koreans really don't trust the Japanese in 2024.
Yeah, like it was I mean, a lot of Westerners I think are quite aware of what happened in Europe and how bad that was. But like what happened in China is just as bad. Like it's just as bad. Like the stuff that the Japanese were doing was way up there in the level of like like uh how horrific people can treat one another.
Yeah. Well, we were talking actually about terror tactics earlier. I think
The Japanese
events
Imperial
like
Army was using terror tactics.
the Nanjing massacre it's a fairly clear example of conventional forces using terror tactics.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's chilling. Like I don't want to go into too much detail, but like there's if you go and like research like Japanese war crimes during the Second Sino-Japanese war or the Pacific War in World War Two. Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. It definitely gave me an appreciation that, like, as I was saying earlier about like dictators or whatever, some of these things are actually not really culturally relative. It's just like anybody from any culture can do crazy stuff. And in the 30s and 40s, what was going on in Europe, committing like by like fascists, was happening in China as well. Or not exactly the same things, but like things of the same degree of like horror were happening.
Yeah, it was a pretty dark time.
It was pretty dark. Like,
it's not a good time.
People are complaining about like Instagram giving like teenage girls like depression and stuff. Like, yeah, okay, that's a problem, but like I can
Actually, yeah, but I'm really glad that those are our problems.
Like, it's a much better problem to have than like what was going on during the 40s.
Yeah, the 30s and 40s were just fucked. just a really bad time.
I always thought, I was like, wow, the 20th century is like darkest century in the history of civilization. And then I started reading more history. And I was like, oh no, actually, like, for example, like the Persians, you did not want to like end up at the pointy end of the Persians' war spear and like lose that battle. Like they were not nice to the people.
When you were part of the empire, it didn't sound that bad being a subject of the Persian Empire.
Yeah.
To a large extent, they just kind of left you alone.
Yeah. Well, as long as you weren't like, say, part of the ruling class of the people that they conquered. In which case,
if you weren't a threat,
you'd have a bad.
If you were a threat, then you're in real. It's kind of like with the Romans, depending on when. But
I think what separates the 20th century from is not necessarily the like qualitatively, it's the same. It's just people being horrible to one another. But it was like the scale of it, like just how many
the technology
and the fact that it happened all over the world, like somewhat simultaneously. Like especially.
Can you imagine like Genghis Khan if he had access to automatic weapons?
Yeah, like yeah, it speaks for itself. Maoism as compared to Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, and so forth. I can't really speak on this. Jack, maybe you could talk about it a little bit more and I'll ask any follow-up questions.
Talked about it a little bit earlier in terms of Maoism's focus on the rural peasants as opposed to the urban proletariat, which is a distinction between it and Marxism. And then also a distinction between Maoism and vanilla Marxism. And something that I guess Maoism has more in common with Leninism is this idea that you don't have to go through all the stages of history in order. So it was the case in Russia, where Leninism came from, where Russia hadn't reached the stage of industrialization and the development of an urban working class in the same way that Marx said would be necessary to move from capitalism to socialism from. And so one of the things Leninism says is that with the presence of a vanguard party of intellectuals who are well versed in Marxism and dialectical materialism, you can kind of jump over certain stages of history to get straight to socialism and communism. And Maoism also has that, because China obviously wasn't as industrialized as Germany was when Marx was writing, or as the United Kingdom was when Marx was writing. And so Mao more looked to Lenin in being able to jump stages of history. Sometimes history needs a push, I think was what Lenin said.
It's very convenient, isn't it?
In justifying that, yeah.
It's very sophisticated.
Well, granted, it's an aspect of Marxism that I think is really silly. I think the stages of history don't have to proceed in exactly as mechanical a way as I think sometimes Marxism either says or is presented as saying. So I think in that actually Lenin was being much more realistic, and Mao followed him on that.
He was trying to get rid of like transcend that
Yeah,
that limitation of the
yeah.
Marxist ideology. Yeah.
An interesting aspect of Mao versus Lenin, and I guess particularly Trotsky, is I'm not actually sure how internationalist Maoism is. Whether it was, say, like Trotskyism, because Trotsky, I guess, also just given the situation between Trotsky and Stalin. So Stalin really began to focus on, he called it socialism in one country, on de-emphasizing the international spread aspect of communism and instead focusing on trying to make it work within the Soviet Union. Trotsky, I think, was an internationalist, but he was probably also reacting to Stalin doing that by really emphasizing the internationalist aspect of Trotskyism. Where Mao sits on that spectrum between global revolution and communism in one country, I'm not actually sure. Mao does really seem to have quite a nationalist element, though, where Lenin, for example, I think de-emphasized the nationalist part, in part because he was building the Soviet Union and probably didn't want nationalist opposition to that from the various constituent members of the Soviet Union. But Mao really seemed to have quite a strong nationalist element of the Chinese nation fighting off foreign invaders and then the Chinese people with their nation standing strong. So that also is a point of distinction between Maoism and other forms of communism. I find it interesting. Also, a lot of Maoism is not. It's not as theoretically worked out as, say, Leninism or Stalinism is more practical, I guess, because a lot of it was just about how to run this empire, which was the Soviet Union. But Mao really, really emphasized praxis and just doing stuff rather than theorizing, which is an element of Maoism that I'm, I guess, sort of sympathetic to. He just wanted to get stuff done.
Yeah, I'm
But
not sure that Mao was really a fan of like over intellectualizing things or
yeah,
intellectuals per
like
se. I'd say he actually had like quite a rich history of
not
practical
trusting
responses
intellectuals,
to intellectuals.
like the 100 Flowers campaign.
Yeah, so that I think that's very consistent with his character. Sure.
Yeah, would Mao have read Slavoj Žižek and been like, "Fuck yeah, this is how we're going to achieve the revolution"?
I assume that Mao probably
Listen to Zizek slobbering about the Big Other or something like that. Be like, yeah, nice. This is what I'm going to be doing in Beijing.
I think that Mao would have put Zizek in front of a firing squad, and to be honest, like a bunch of the other like modern kind of Marxist types, he would just be like, no, like just dispatch them, and let's go back to writing some like instruction manuals about how to deploy guerrillas.
Lost his mind over how good Foucault was for fighting guerrilla wars.
Oh man, fire out.
Actually, it would have been very, very funny. Mao Zedong meeting a lot of particularly French Marxist theorists.
I just don't think he would.
Absolutely hilarious.
He just wouldn't have had any patience for it. Hey, he just seemed. He's just like not. Just wanted to get shit done. Hey.
Yeah. Which is like, so I for anyone who's listened to this podcast for any period
Jack
of time,
is about to start
completely unsurprising. But like, I don't like Mao's aims, but I do really admire how practical he was. He just
pump.
Yeah, Mao's gains, Mao's physique, and in addition to Mao's physique, also his ability to organize things and his really just steadfast practicality.
He was a bit of a chubby fuck though, wasn't he? Like he clearly didn't work out enough.
He was a powerlifter.
You just see like pictures of Mao,
the reason why there wasn't enough food on the long march shorts is because Mao was on a mega bulk.
Yeah.
No one else could eat anything because Mao needed to get.
Everybody else is walking and fucking Mao's on a donkey or some shit.
No, Mao's bench pressing the donkey and making sure he's getting 4,000 calories a day. Mao permabulk Zedong.
It's like that 4,000 calories was supposed to be divided up between 60,000 troops, and Mao just had it all.
Yeah, Mao was just bulking on everything he could possibly get his hands on.
So we've got two more questions for episode-specific questions.
Yeah, let me have a look.
How does guerrilla warfare differ in different wars? I don't know if I can speak a lot about this. Do you have a sense of?
Yeah, I don't know how much I can really say about that historic. Like,
No,
I don't know the military history.
I think the next
I'm not
question is
that
better.
interested in military history.
Yeah.
So
The next question is better. Modern and future effectiveness of guerrilla warfare in light of like technological advances that seem to give a lot more
just has
leverage.
to keep going up.
But so I thought, like, it seems to me like if you've got a military that has like satellite images, like a whole bunch of like intelligence operations, can bug all your phones and stuff, is watching like your communications, and can even do things like light drones and like go and use LiDAR, like high resolution local imaging and stuff like the US can. Like, does that even leave that much space for guerrilla warfare to even be that effective against something like the US?
I guess it depends on how you conceptualize it. So if you think about what Mao set out as the aims of an effective guerrilla strategy are things like harrying an enemy's rear. So that's the case if you're fighting against a conventional army. There's always going to be a rear somewhere.
Yeah.
Really interestingly, with what you just said, because you were just listing basically communications technologies or things like, say, with the drone, like assassination techniques that are really made much more deadly using communications technologies, like the ability to shoot a rocket at someone from a drone, or like what's happening in Ukraine now, where they just strap grenades to a consumer drone and fly it at someone.
That's hectic. Yeah.
So the ability to, or disrupting communications of the enemy, Mao said, was a really important thing that guerrilla fighting did. And like that, the fight is going to be different. Instead of a bunch of peasants sitting in a hole in rural China waiting to shoot Japanese messages or something, it's going to be a bunch of people on laptops trying to disrupt satellite communications.
Yeah.
I reckon particularly the communications aspect, they'll be doing it differently, but it might be more important if you can knock out, say, such a technologically dependent military as the United States' ability to communicate with troops or to coordinate or to use their really, really high-tech methods of killing people like drones. If you can interfere with that by interfering with the communications, if you define guerrilla operations as in part doing that, then I only see them as getting more important.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Well, I guess like I was really focusing on the technology, but you've made a really good point. Actually, again, to go back to what you said earlier in the episode, it's a style of warfare. And because the style, if you're adopting that style, you'll just use whatever technology is appropriate to fight with that style. So in this case, like consumer drones and grenades, or was it IUDs? Is that
Oh, that's a good thing to bring up, actually, because like we did just see in Afghanistan,
exactly,
a guerrilla
like
group successfully fighting a guerrilla campaign against the United States
for a very long period of time.
Yeah.
So like I still think it's a good question, but like I would say
a really
like,
good question, because it shows that these tactics are still very, very viable. And as I guess maybe with the sovereign, it reminds me of what was said in the Sovereign Individual about how, with at least the direction that technology is going in, it's getting cheaper and cheaper to be very, very dangerous in terms of the ability to act violently for a single person or a small group. And I only see that as making guerrilla warfare more dangerous.
Yeah. Decent. Well, it's all about decentralized warfare, right? So if the technology enables decentralization, then yeah. So an interesting thing, the sub point to that though, and this is our final like episode specific question, is just because it's what I do, cyber war as one of the new frontiers of guerrilla war.
Yeah, damn. Yeah.
I thought like, this is actually like even the nation states are doing this, right? Like the intelligence and military operations of the US and of Russia and so forth are using the cyber analog of guerrilla tactics against one another.
Yeah, well, there's that. And then imagine, uh, I don't know, this is probably stretching the definitions a bit, but non-human actors acting as guerrilla cyber warriors. So if you can have, say, an LLM that can an LLM virus, computer virus, that can rewrite elements of its code to avoid detection or avoid deletion. You could even have non-human entities acting in some way as guerrilla fighters in cyberspace.
Yeah, I would say it's not stretching the definition. It's just like, yeah, you've got to think about it in terms of like this new landscape. But actually, like, there's these companies, including Tesla, that are working on robotics. So real world robotics. I think it'll be analogous to like narrow AI and machine learning being used to like solve specific problems, digital or information based problems. They're trying to figure out like narrow robotics, which is already the case already, like even the washing machine or whatever. But like for example, narrow robotics within say like a factory setting. But they're also working on like creating a broader range. I mean, at some point I assume they want to go for like full generality of like robots that can effectively do any physical task that a human could do. And you could imagine a future where if you have like large parts of the economy are automated through these like broad range or general purpose robotics that are being controlled remotely, whether they're fully autonomous or like they're remote operated, actually you like that becomes a target for guerrilla ops. Like pretty obviously, yeah.
Def guerrilla _war bracket colon.
Yeah, so that's a terrifying future. I'd rather think about how much better Amazon Prime is going to get in like 10 years rather than thinking about the inevitable guerrilla warfare between.
But then you think about too, actually, with what you were saying, because that what you were just laying out sounds like the sort of thing that a conventional military would have the resources to do, to make murder bots. But then it's almost the sort of thing that a guerrilla cell can do, is effectively how to seize control of them. How to hack into them and seize control of them. So
it's a crazy new world, hey? One of the interesting things reading about cybersec, there's a great book. I wish I could remember the name of it so I can recommend it. But anyways, this author was saying like everybody's now on the front lines with cyber war. Like, because now a hospital is a target that, like Romanian hacker, or maybe I don't know why I said Romanian. A hacker from any part of the world who doesn't like people.
A hacker from Eastern Europe.
Who's probably just like a 15-year-old fucking around and
a 15-year-old Serbian kid
wanting to make some Bitcoin or something. But it could be like also somebody who's a political enemy. And now all of a sudden, and not all of a sudden, it's been like the last 30 years basically since the internet started taking off, all of our hospitals, all the civilian infrastructure anywhere in the world that is connected to the internet is now on the front line of this sort of warfare.
Yeah, it's all subject to ransomware attacks or whatever else is dreamed up, like whichever new way. People can be coerced into behaving in the way that you want them to behave.
Did you see in the Snowden, one of the things that Snowden released was that I think it was either in Seoul, Korea, or it was in Japan. Maybe it was in Japan. It turns out that like basically the US had go and watch the Snowden documentary. Like it goes into like, I'll fuck it up, but like roughly speaking, some Asian country, like their electrical grid was essentially all bugged by the US, and it was like the US could basically switch off this country's like power if it turned out that
what a trustworthy ally.
It's just like, oh my god, that's like, imagine just tens of millions of people all of a sudden just don't have power. All the hospitals, all like the fuel, all the like communications infrastructure just goes off.
Yeah, and I guess the thing probably restraining the US from doing that is the fact that I guarantee their electrical grid is also probably full of hostile foreign powers.
Yeah, for sure. And also like, yeah, it's just it's kind of like the same logic, I suppose, as the nuclear stalemate, right? It's like if we all get to the point where we have like bugged the shit out of each other's like energy and telecommunications infrastructure, then who wants to pull the trigger on that? Because it escalates
we're just going to
very
Stone
quickly.
Age each other.
Yeah. Anyways, I'm glad that we've finished on a good note. It's a very positive note.
Yeah, so for all growth mindset individuals, the future of guerrilla warfare is pretty bright.
Yeah.
It's almost an unlimited ability for you to wage new forms of guerrilla warfare, limited only by your imagination.
Fan
Computers are
fucking
bicycles for the mind, and your mind is really a bicycle for waging guerrilla war. It's a bicycle riding it. One level of recursion of a bicycle.
Yeah, with like grenades strapped to the side and stuff.
Yeah, nice.
Okay, so would we recommend On Guerrilla Warfare by Mao Zedong?
Depends how much of a Mao fanboy you are. If someone is a fan of Mao, then this is an easy recommend. If someone's interested in Mao, I can.
Or if you're
pretty
interested
easily
in war,
recommend it.
like you know,
Or
like some
war,
people are
yeah.
like war
If you
buffs,
like war a lot,
like war history and stuff. Yeah, it's interesting.
if you're a German history student, not to stereotype, shout out to Yarp, and you're interested in war, you probably like this.
Yeah, it is really interesting. It's not as ideological and stuff as other books that we've read. It's very practical.
Yeah. It does make me interested in reading other guerrilla war manuals that have been recommended to us. I think there's one called War of the Flea or something like that we've been asked to do a few times. We could do. If if this episode doesn't get us on a watch list, then we can offer more detailed advice on guerrilla warfare.
It's like somebody in ASIO gets a tip off. It's like, watch these guys. They're talking about guerrilla war. They're just like, these guys, they're a couple of idiots. Little do they know the rise of crypto nukes Queensland.
There's so much waste in the budget. Surely the Australian government, like in the budget, can be at least one subscription to the Patreon $60,000 tier.
Yeah,
that's
we get a
rounding error in the
subscriber and it
Australian
just says
budget.
ASIO.
Well, ASIO needs to get access to the bonus episodes.
Yeah.
To properly monitor it. So they at least need to be on the like $3 tier or whatever our lowest one is.
Okay, so
shout out to our personal ASIO agent. Please sign up to the Patreon.
Yeah, you've got budget for it. We know, motherfuckers.
Yeah. We know you've got the budget for it.
Okay. Did Mao solve his problem? Yes.
He was really he ended up winning the Civil War.
And history bears that out. He won, or I don't know, like it was pretty severe victory, I suppose. But they at least, I don't know if you'd say they won the Sino. I know they did win the Second Sino-Japanese War.
They achieved their objectives.
But I mean, it was a pretty high price to pay. And to me, it seems more like they outlasted Japan, basically.
But that's kind of guerrilla war in the context of fighting against an invader.
Yeah, so they did win. And their strategy was just like, we will grind these bastards down.
Yeah. And Mao was pretty open about that in this book.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Anyways, and then he was effective like in the second part of the Civil War, like when
yeah, well he was effective in, I'm not sure actually how effective the communist guerrilla operations really were against the Japanese. But he was, at the very least, very effective in setting up the communists to continue fighting the Civil War to victory.
I'd say he figured it out. Mao won.
Yeah.
Mao won that.
Yeah.
So how could it be improved? I have no improvements to suggest to Mao Zedong.
Pictures. Really good hand-drawn pictures by Mao himself.
Yeah, like a couple of those, you know those NFL like diagrams of like you got the X's and the circles with arrows pointing around? Like, a couple of those would have been nice. Make it a little bit more visual.
No, I was thinking hentai. Like I know this is an anti-Japanese tract, but they could borrow tactics from the enemy to increase the number of horny, spotty teenage boys who want to read this book by including a bunch of drawn porn in it.
Yeah.
That was a tactical error on behalf of Mao.
Yeah. Well, okay, we're going to sign out now. We got a couple of things.
This didn't even count.
I have nothing to add to that, Jack. I just don't know what to say. Come on now, take up your
retreat.
Yeah.
Levi's fighting the guerrilla war of podcast co-hosting.
We're going to move on to shout-outs. As Jack said, shout out to you shouted out Yarp before.
To Yarp.
Shout out to Heilig, just one of the OGs of the server. And shout out to you, whoever you are listening right now. Subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Saint Mao
subscribe
Zedong.
across different channels. You're a champion if you listened all the way to the end, because you could have just read the book.
Shout out, actually, Ketamine Enjoyer has been commenting a lot recently. Shout out to Ketamine Enjoyer.
Yeah, good vibes.
Very Doomer vibes. Extremely Doomer vibes.
Oh well.
What have we got next? I think we got the Turner Diaries next. I've read
that's
like
pretty
60
dark,
pages of it.
Right, like I haven't started reading it. I need to start reading it today.
It's not as horrible as I thought it'd be. They've already killed a Jewish person with a jar of kosher pickles because the author has a keen sense of racist irony. But
Yeah.
I guess this is the highest praise I'll give it. It's not as awful as I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, it's a book that will do.
It's a book that we just keep getting asked to do. It's like, yeah, if you're persistent enough, I get guerrilla warfare tactic. If you're persistent enough, we'll eventually cave and cover the fucking Turner Diaries.
Yeah, sure. Like,
but I'm not happy
every now and
with
then. Look, that's why we've got to change it up. Every now and then we'll do like, the art of the deal or something. I can't just do like non-stop, like hectic, like mass murderers and like white supremacy stuff all the time. Like, we need to break it up.
We need a break. This book was kind of a break because it was short. It was clearly written, and it wasn't like it's basically arguing for a war of national liberation, which is a lot less objectionable than a lot of other stuff that we read.
Yeah. Hey, I think is that brings us to the end of the episode.
That brings us to the end. I'm going to go eat lunch.
Yeah.
I'm going to go eat lunch and tend to my big swollen eye.
If you like what we do, join our Discord, subscribe, and
buy my book.
We're going to and buy Jack's book at jackbc.me, and there'll be some updates coming along soon. We've been working tirelessly in the background about how we can like come up with some like more interesting stuff, like upgrade our Patreon or whatever. So
irresistible value proposition.
We'll be figuring out irresistible value propositions, offering you guys Mafia offers that you can't refuse.
Yeah, you can't physically refuse.
Yeah, but that will be opt-in and non-coercive. But
look, it will. Yeah, well, I guess technically, but it will be just such a good deal
that you can't help.
You couldn't psychologically say no to it.
Anyways, thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening.